The waggle is a seemingly involuntary twitch that golfers perform in preparation to swing back and hit the golf ball. And when I was first in the business as an apprentice, the PGA gave us materials to help us to learn how to teach, included in which was a fairly lengthy segment on how to waggle. Now, prior to that, for the entire history of the teaching of the game, the preceding 50 or 60 years, it had been characteristic of most authors, most notoriously effective teachers, that the waggle was actually taught. But then fast forward to when I was given that material, the subsequent years, they quit putting it in the material. And the reason was that the best golfer in the world was Jack Nicklaus. And he did a wristy waggle, the typical one from the previous few centuries, if not the entirety of the history of the game. And yet he advocated a swing that had no intentional wrist action on the backswing other than what occurred naturally at the end because of the momentum of the club. So they quit teaching the waggle. And if you look nowadays at modern players, you'll see that they don't do, apart from Jason Duffner, they don't do the old traditional wristy one, but it's worthy of a conversation in the pub. Ben Hogan, of course, was very particular about the waggle, and he had lovely diagrams demonstrating it. And preceding him, Percy Boomer, a very wonderful teacher with a great reputation, who wrote a book on learning golf, talked about the waggle fairly late in the book, but he did discuss it. And his point was that it was an opportunity to gauge the involvement of the hands in the takeaway. Prior to him, a very famous golfer, Ernest Jones, had talked about a golf swing being effectively a swinging motion. Swing the Club Head was his very famous book. And he had a jackknife tied to the end of a long handkerchief, which he would swing back and forth. He was relatively vague in his book about what in fact was impelling the handkerchief with the weight on the end. So I always thought that it was probably less helpful than he hoped it would be. But he gave the idea that the material, the musculature, the activities that were actually starting the swing were really the back and the legs and the feet. And of course, in those days, it was not at all uncommon that golfers would start the swing with almost an invert press, where the club would be left behind for a few milliseconds and the hands would be fairly well into the backswing before the club moved, a sort of a dragging motion. And that was very associated with Ernest Jones's ideas. Now, back to the point about the wrists. So Percy Boomer thought that if the wrists were too violent, they were demonstrating that the hands were going to be involved in the swing. And he described it as the dog tail wagging the dog, because he thought that the hands should not be the thing initiating the swing, but that the back and the legs and hips should be actually starting the motion. So back to what the wristy waggles accomplished. It was generally thought that they alerted the body of immediate employment, impending employment, and that it would also establish the right amount of flex and strength required. In other words, if you squeeze too hard, you would know it. And if it was too loose, you'd know that too. So it also was associated with some rather interesting padding of the feet, which is not always noticed. When champions were wristy waggling, their feet would be subtly lifting from one to the other by just shifting their weight. Well, that's in anticipation of that use of the legs and back to initiate the swing. But also it allowed them to fine tune because, of course, golf has two major variables that other sports don't deal with. Different length of club every subsequent shot and a different slope of ground. And so you need to be really quite accurate. It's been found by Cochrane and Stobbs's wonderful book, probably 30 odd years ago, that a 3/4 inch variation was the most that a competent golfer would allow. And the rest of the world had a 3-inch variation over subsequent shots with the same length club. So we need to be able to gauge those things with some precision. And just padding back and forth as you waggle allows you to subtly fine-tune the location of your feet. It's quite simple. If you feel that you're off balance, you'll move your feet until you're on balance, and that allows you to fine tune. So now what you'll see, and I and a few other golf instructors over the years in the 90s started to teach more of this wooden waggle as I describe it. I describe it as a windshield wiper blade, cleaning a portion of the windshield very slowly and back to the ball. And that wrist-free waggle has actually taken over. If you watch champions nowadays, virtually none of them do the wristy one. They all do the rather wooden one. And the benefit is this: it allows you to confirm that you've actually adopted the right postures, the right shapes. I talk about biasing the left arm, but other things too. And can you take that to the ball, or have you already lost it? I've found that when I teach that to people, by the time they get to the ball, it's all unraveled. So this is a good way to confirm that you've been able to keep it. It also shows you how to start the backswing, and it allows you to fine-tune that distance from the ball. So now you see a slightly more elaborate version where people take the club all the way back to about halfway, and they're checking things like, is the club still angled with the body? And is the shaft looking more at the middle and keeping the head of the club, as they describe, in front of the body? And so the modern one is more wrist-free and valuable.